in this hour, we speak with historian and sociologist, author, and professor Harvey J. Kaye on a subject that I thought might be interesting to you, and I think will definitely be interesting to me. I hope Harvey's not bored either. The subject is we've got a presidential primary going on, a lot of candidates on the Democratic side. How do they stack up against the legacy of the person that is arguably, and is in my book, the greatest of all Democratic presidents so far? I'm speaking of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Harvey is an expert in that area, including having written the book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great. Like many of us, he has been following political developments on the Democratic side. He is also, by the way, to give him his full due, he is director of the Center for History and Social Change at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay. And he joins us now. So Harvey, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. And, you know, when people speak about Franklin D. Roosevelt, we were talking a little bit before this segment began, you know, they speak about the legacy of Roosevelt. I remember when Barack Obama was running for president, I remember thinking, well, he's going to disappoint us if he gets in for the first year or so, but maybe like Roosevelt, he'll rise to the occasion and do transformative things. Now, I would argue that did not happen, but I got that one wrong. But what did FDR, it got me curious because I've never really studied it. What did FDR say when he was running for president the first time?
Yeah, that's it. By the way, I'll just say that your reference to Barack Obama and what his possibilities might have been, I think I've got a stack of magazines here in the office in which many a cover, both right-wing and left-wing liberal covers, portrayed Barack Obama as the resurrected FDR, and of course we did not see a New Deal. But if we go back to 1932, when Roosevelt was running for president, and if you were to ask most historians, they would tell you, well, Roosevelt really didn't know what he was going to do. This was all a sort of an ongoing ambition of his to be president. But if you look closely at his speeches through the course of 1932, he actually laid out a fairly interesting roster, a really dynamic roster. In fact, even today, an impressive roster of what he would hope to do as president, which he, of course, based in good part on the fact that they were necessary steps in light of the Great Depression that was already underway for at least 2 years. And moreover, he had been governor of the state of New York, which, by the way, in those days were 2-year terms. And as a consequence, he had had an opportunity to both address the Great Depression and then run for office again in light of what he had been doing and hoped to do again. Now, when he ran for president in the course of that year in 1932, he didn't open up with the term the New Deal. The New Deal becomes a term that he uses in his acceptance speech in Chicago that year. But in leading up to that moment of securing the nomination, think about the things that he called for. He called for regulating Wall Street, regulating financial actions. He called for massive public works projects. I mean, he was really committed to eventually pursuing things that we come to know of as the Tennessee Valley Authority and related, in good part because he was influenced by George Norris, a progressive Republican senator from Nebraska, and also by his own activities in developing, I guess you'd say, the northern tier of the St. Lawrence River for energy in New York State. He also called for environmental renewal. The term he would have used was the refurbishment of America's lands and forests. And even there, as governor of New York, he had established what would later be reflected in his first 100 days, the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps. I think it was called the Temporary Emergency Relief Act when he was in New York State. He also called for easing the debt burden of farmers and homeowners. I mean, we saw you and I didn't, but of course our parents and grandparents' generations saw foreclosures of farms, foreclosures on mortgages, and people really were out on the street or out on the highway. He also called for raising the purchasing power of workers. And then but he called for old age pensions, which of course would later become Social Security. Now, if we think about that list, we can see it reflected in many ways in the promises, the plans that are floated by Democratic candidates. So regulating Wall Street. Well, there are those who, such as Bernie, who believe we have to do all the more about controlling the power of big capital. Similarly, obviously the case for Elizabeth Warren. We see in terms of public works projects this new discussion of the need for infrastructure development, environmental renewal. We see the Green New Deal that's been floated both by the young Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Merkley, is it?
Markey, Ed Markey. Of Massachusetts.
Yeah.
We had Merkley on Merkley's on the show this week, but not Markey.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then also Bernie himself had floated something of that idea beforehand, and I don't think we should leave him out of that picture. Moreover, the easing of debt burden. Now, the easing of debt burden, which had to do with farms and homes, today we could see it as the easing of debt burden for students. And we have significant promises made, especially by Elizabeth Warren, in addressing the student debt burden. And of course, raising workers' purchasing power. Well, one by one, they're all subscribing to a minimum wage of $15 an hour. Though I would point out, when Roosevelt signed into law the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1932, when he signed it, it did include the first effort at a minimum wage, but he didn't say we have to establish a minimum wage when he signed it. He said we need to create a living wage for workers in America. And he even went so far as to say no company should be allowed to operate in the United States that did not provide a living wage. And then, of course, old age pension, Social Security. We've secured Social Security to a great extent. We know it's under constant attack by way of the assaults on now Obamacare, and then also Medicare, Medicaid, and indeed Social Security itself from the right and the Republican Party. But if we think about it today, we see the degree to which we now have Democrats once again beginning to line up. Must be at least 4 or 5 of them who've called for Medicare for all, following Bernie's lead. So there is this base, this Democrat, or if you like, this Democratic legacy, this Franklin Roosevelt legacy, which is not simply a consequence of the New Deal. It's actually a consequence of the promises he made when running for president. And if I can just. Go ahead.
Sure. Just a couple things about that that struck me. One is that there's become a sort of folklore that you're contradicting with this historical record, a folklore that FDR somehow, when he ran, was viewed as and almost presented himself as a kind of feckless, unambitious. Yeah, this wealthy guy without any particular strong ideas or commitment, who just had to be pushed by events into a form of greatness, but did not display any of that ambition when he was running for office. Everything you've just said contradicts that perception of FDR.
Right. I mean, look, Roosevelt wasn't an intellectual. How many presidents have we had who were specifically intellectuals? But Roosevelt, even as a young man, when people really had thought of him as a lightweight upstate New Yorker with a lot of money, the fact was that even then, if you read some of his early speeches in his runs for office in New York State, one in particular, I think it was before something called the People's Forum in 1911, 1912, it's a very flawed speech, one that if read today, one might sort of imagine there were these racialist elements in his mind. But more importantly, you can see even then he's desperately trying, in his own words, because this is before someone would have written his speeches, in his own words, he's trying to figure out an alternative to the sort of laissez-faire capitalism that prevailed, this sort of Gilded Age capitalism. And he's trying to figure out a way between capitalism and socialism that involves cooperation. And you can see, in essence, his effort to sort of move towards what you and I would call social democracy. And this comes up again in some speeches he gave during the 1920s. He gave one speech in the 1920s at Milton Academy up in Boston to, teenage boys. And in this, he actually warns, about what it's titled Whither Bound. And in it, he warns what will become of us if conservatives continue to govern and rule in America. This is a nation, there's not only a dynamic nation, that it has this promise that needs to be filled through basically progressive action. So when he is a governor of New York and then to run for president, he had an aide, or if you like, a chief of staff named Judge Samuel Rosenman. And Rosenman, who had also worked for Al Smith before him, before Roosevelt, actually suggested to Franklin that maybe they'd want to create what they called a brains trust and bring together a few professors to throw ideas around and sort of cultivate. Roosevelt wanted to do things. He was already doing things, but this great brains trust would enable him to articulate them more clearly, perhaps in terms of vision and policy. And a lot of this really comes out of his conversations with the brains trust, when he would explain to these folks, look, these are the kind of things I want to do, and they would come up with ideas. They included an agricultural economist named Rexford Tugwell from Columbia University, a political science professor named Robert Moley, and also the lawyer, Albert Burley. I mean, it was really quite a remarkable team he put together. It was outstanding when it came to being able to choose people who would be able to help him articulate the things that he thought were important.
So he wasn't an intellectual per se, but in the same way that some people might view John F. Kennedy, who was not an intellectual either, but was interested in what intellectuals had to say. He was open to advice. He was open. He was not. He certainly wasn't anti-intellectual, and in that sense, his speech. I don't know when he gave his speech to the young boys of the academy.
1925, I think it was.
1925. So Andrew Mellon had not yet become Treasury Secretary, if my chronology is right. But you had, as the kind of counterpoint, and almost to illustrate FDR's point that he made in that speech, you had people like Andrew Mellon, who was Herbert Hoover's Secretary of the Treasury, saying during this period of national crisis, let the farms be foreclosed, let the homes be foreclosed, let everything collapse to its lowest level and do nothing about it, and then essentially let the wealthy pick things up from there and begin rebuilding them. And I'm paraphrasing his famous.
Yes.
So in fact, he was prescient in that sense, in that the conservative worldview then, as I would argue now, was basically a dystopian one. And so he runs not as he's been portrayed, but with an agenda that seems quite progressive, and with a record as governor of having been open to the ideas of thinkers, of intellectuals, of a mixed and fertile group of idea generators. Anybody now at this stage of the Democratic primary, you've mentioned Bernie Sanders a couple times, you've mentioned Elizabeth Warren. Anybody else that comes to mind as being just in the way that they are campaigning, of becoming a potential Roosevelt, of showing the same bold ideas in their campaign platform, of showing the same openness to thinkers and brain trusts of various kinds?
Well, it's funny you ask that, and I'm going to answer that, but one other thing I wanted to point out about that 32 campaign, if you don't mind, is that in the autumn of 1932, I guess it was in October of 1932, or September, he gave a speech out in California, FDR, which was absolutely brilliant, in which he calls for an economic declaration of rights. And that was a decidedly radical thing to do in 1932. So with that in mind, I'll now answer the question that you just posed. As you know, my prior major book before the FDR book was a book titled Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. And in addition to Thomas Paine's revolutionary role in the American Revolution, a radical role of writing common sense and calling on Americans to turn their rebellion into a revolution, not only for independence, but for a democratic republic, he goes on, Thomas Paine, in the course of the remainder of his life, which is many years, he doesn't pass away until 1809, but he also goes on to write Rights of Man during the French Revolution, and later, in the later 1790s, he writes Agrarian Justice, which is recognized as, between the two of them, recognized as if you like, the first real call for what we think of as Social Security. So Paine calls for for taxes on the landed wealthy in order to provide payments to young people to give them a start in life and to combat poverty. Now, people have asked me, well, surely you must be fascinated by Andrew Yang, who has proposed, the basic income. I forgot, what's the term? The
universal basic income is one of them. The UBI, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm not so sure Paine would go that far, but that's an interesting idea. I have serious reservations about that, just given American culture and American politics, that might be viewed as even more decidedly un-American. I think there are more effective ways of addressing inequality than starting to hand out people money. And people like jobs in America, and I think they want jobs that pay a living wage, jobs that are productive, jobs that are meaningful. And that was central to Roosevelt. But Andrew,
I can't let the UBI, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I can't let the UBI pass without giving my own thought
right ahead, sure.
At this point about it, which is that I believe that while we can debate the merits of the idea, and remember the Senate almost passed, came one vote short, I believe, under Richard Nixon of passing a minimum guaranteed income and so on.
Yeah.
But as currently designed and marketed by Silicon Valley types, which I think is a category that includes Andrew Yang, I think it's generally based on the belief that the current economic system will render, if you read the works of economist Tyler Cohen, for example, 85% of the workforce redundant, and therefore, rather than prevent such a dystopian future, it's an accommodation to that dystopian future. So given its history and its context, I ain't for it. I just got to get that out of the way. There are other bold ideas, jobs guarantee, Green New Deal, all that we can talk about. But, and again, let me just take a quick break and say we're talking with historian and sociologist Harvey J. Kaye about the FDR legacy and its reflection or thereabouts in the current political climate and the current campaign. So, where were we?
To come back to the question you asked me, it was coincidental. I kid with my students. I say, can you name all of the Democratic candidates, right? And every day another one joins in. So today I think we hit 21. Okay, but the students say to me, well, what are these people calling for? And I go over this list, and this is in response to your question. And clearly, a good many of them are offering ideas about how to address America's crisis today. I mean, Marianne Williamson, is that her name? Marianne Williamson?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That, she wants to cultivate love in America, for what that's worth, okay? And there are others. Eric Swalwell, who entered just about a week or so ago, coincidentally, as long as we're talking FDR, who, of course, articulated the Four Freedoms, Eric Swalwell, who was born in Iowa, but is now a congressman from California, I think it was last summer, in fact, was visiting Iowa, testing the waters, checking out his hometown and trying to identify himself, I suppose, as a favorite son. He actually began to quote the FDR's Four Freedoms. So I had this hope that he was going to make the Four Freedoms themselves fundamental to his campaign. Right now, he seems to be pressing particularly hard on the question of gun control as his foremost agenda item, and my God, I would back him fully on that kind of question.
Well, another thought about Eric Swalwell is he is also pushing very hard, which I'm astonished by in this day and age, the notion of bipartisanship and working with Republicans. Now, going back to our theme of, comparing the candidates today with FDR's first run, if I recall correctly, and you'll know, but I believe that Hoover, the Republican president of the time, reached out to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was not all in the transition period, and Roosevelt was really, no, you do your thing, I'll do mine when I come in. Right. So I do not, on that score at least, I would not rate Eric Swalwell as ranking very high on the FDR-o-meter.
No. And by the way, don't misunderstand what I was saying. I was just trying to review, do any of these people have ideas? No, and in fact, it's interesting to say that. I mean, Roosevelt was smart enough to know he did not want to be Hoover was trying to grab Roosevelt to join in. And remember, those were days in which presidents were inaugurated in early March.
Right.
So there was this long transition. And as far as Roosevelt was concerned, he did not want to be tainted, with the brush, or is that the word? Tainted with the brush of Hoover's failures.
Tarred, I think, but okay, tarred.
Yeah, tarred. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, no, and I agree with you. And so, as I should have added, I've been disappointed that Swalwell has not pursued the Four Freedoms idea more effectively.
let me just
Roosevelt,
jump in, and before you go on, let me just jump in and remind our audience what the four freedoms were. And I will quiz myself here because I'm not sure, but I think, okay,
okay,
freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Is that correct?
yes, and I would tell you on a test, I would give you an A on that, but there might be someone else who'd say, but you left out, it's freedom of speech and expression.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. All right. Well,
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, mostly because he had in mind, I think, smartly Roosevelt had in mind not only the idea of speech, but also the idea that, I mean, I think he had this thing about that he did not want to leave the arts out of this kind of vision of his. So, which of course comes out in later in the course of the Works Progress Administration with the Federal One projects, the art project, the theater project, the music project, and the writing project. But to come back to the candidates, I mean, we could look at each one of them and we'd find something that might lead us to see some link into the Democratic FDR tradition, the FDR legacy. But what's interesting about it is, as they try to do that, for example, Buttigieg made the remark that he saw himself as a New Deal capitalist in his ideology, right? But it really is the case that they're all playing catch up with Bernie Sanders and perhaps Elizabeth Warren. I mean, I'm not trying to push anyone into subscribing to the candidate who I will vote for in the primaries, but it is the case that Bernie led the way towards a more, if you like, well, clearly towards a social democratic politics during the 2016 campaign. And although, as you know, I was very disappointed he didn't make even more of the FDR legacy at the time. He did make it a point, at least in one major speech, of connecting his own ideas to the thinking of FDR's second Bill of Rights speech of January 1944, where FDR laid out a full economic declaration or economic Bill of Rights that, in essence, followed up both on his call for an economic declaration of rights in 1932 and his call for the four freedoms as the war aims of the United States and as a vision for a post-war world. And so Bernie really has led the charge on that. But I'll also say that one cannot help but be impressed as a progressive and social democrat how Elizabeth Warren has really tried to turn the more generic idea of social democracy, though it's not a term she uses, into a series of policy initiatives that she would like to pursue. So if you take Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, it really is the case that you have the makings of the renewal of the FDR tradition, the FDR legacy. And I can tell you that I'm impressed by both. And otherwise, I mean, it's nice to see that Kamala Harris has endorsed Medicare for all, although I believe there was some backtracking recently. Cory Booker has, in spite of his relationship to Wall Street, has even himself, come out in favor, I believe, of Medicare for all. So if we think about Medicare for all, and remember, it was part of the renewal of the Social Security Act in 1965, we can see the way in which there's this reaching back. However, it still remains the case that the Democrats have fully to appreciate the power of FDR's legacy. And they just still don't quite grasp that it would be in their best interest, collectively and all the more individually for some of them, to lay claim to American history. You've heard me bellyache about this all the time, I think. To really lay claim to American history and really reclaim American history from this 40 years of class war from above that has involved this sort of claim that American exceptionalism makes America superior somehow. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. And I think that one of the ways to reclaim that, Harvey Kaye, is by understanding the scope and the imagination of behind the vision of a leader like FDR. And in other words, I mean, some people may even remember, the French left of 1968, all power to the imagination, all that. But the fact is that FDR, for example, people don't think about the name Social Security, about the fact that, well, for a system of retirement and disability insurance, that's a very kind of poetic name when you stop and think about it, Social Security, because it reflected a vision of a society in which every citizen was secure, to go far beyond simply as great as those things are, retirement and disability insurance. So the notion of the four freedoms, the notion of an economic bill of rights, the fact that we at least have a couple Democratic candidates willing to explore that, and others who feel that they need to pay at a minimum lip service to its ideas. You know, I think, for example, Kamala Harris has not embraced that language, but at one point she tinkered with an idea for a minimum income for people under 100,000. She's almost like she's looking for a big idea, like they all
Yes,
have to
clearly.
come. So there is, it seems to me, but I'm very interested in your thoughts. It seems to me that there's fertile ground as FDR came forward at a moment when there was, for obvious reasons, fertile ground for imagination, for vision, that there's fertile ground for it again now, and that what the Democrats need to do is be willing to, fertilize it with
Yeah,
big ideas.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll just so people don't think I'm unidimensional in my thinking about Bernie. I will say that I wish Bernie had joined the Democratic Party in December of 2016, so he could have been seen, in fact, as the leader of the party. I do wish that he had used the term social democracy, because I think it would have resonated powerfully in American experience. And I do think the more people lay hold of this sort of tradition of FDR in the Democratic Party, the more likely it is that Americans will wake up and be more willing to embrace these initiatives, not as somehow popping out of the head of a politician who's trying to pander to them, but rather as a politician who appreciates the degree to which this is deeply embedded in the American experience. This is the thing. This is one of the things that really gets to me. Do you know that people should remember that FDR won election in 32 and then was reelected president 3 times? I mean,
Right.
3 times. Think about that. That's first. Second of all, in 1943, when Roosevelt was thinking about how to put more meaning into the four freedoms, he had the National Opinion Research Committee, whatever it was, council, that was then headquartered at Princeton University. He had them do surveys to find out what it is that Americans wanted after the war. Richard, can you still see me, by the way?
Yes, I can.
Okay, because the camera here is sort of loopy a bit. But yeah, so Roosevelt wanted to know, what do Americans want after the war? And this was a major research project that was undertaken by this group at Princeton. And what they found out is that Americans wanted a whole series of social democratic initiatives. And to tell you just how popular these things were, in 1943 and 44, 85% of Americans, this includes Republicans and Democrats, like Democrats 95% and Republicans 75%, wanted national health care. Unreservedly, national health care. Okay, and Roosevelt loved the idea, because when he pushed for Social Security with Francis Perkins, his Secretary of Labor, in 1936, the original idea was to get national health care as part of Social Security, but the American Medical Association and a whole host of very conservative organizations basically warned that they would campaign no end to block Social Security, and he figured, okay, let's get Social Security started. We can revisit it later and include national health care. And even Truman, as little of a social democrat as he was very eager to try to pursue FDR's Second Bill of Rights. And if anyone's interested, they should have a look. Just type in Google Second Bill of Rights, and you'll see the full list of 16 ideas that Roosevelt had to build in as a Second Bill of Rights in America.
Well, that gets us into the sort of the quagmire I can't resist wandering into from time to time of alternate history of what if FDR had lived? What if he had not replaced Henry Wallace as his vice president in 1944, and Wallace, rather than Truman, had become president? That's so fascinating, Harvey. I had no idea that Americans expressed that desire for what they wanted their post-war world to look like. Instead, what they got was, for some people, was several decades of growth, but growth based on consumerism, I would say, accelerated consumerism, and growth that sadly did not last beyond the Carter-Reagan era. So what might have been, I suppose?
That's a good question of what might have been there. Let me just say this. I'm not quite as enthusiastic about Henry Wallace as our dear friend John Nichols is.
Well, okay. I didn't get that from Nichols, but okay. Yeah.
No. Believe me, I didn't think you did. But John is working on this. John Nichols is working on what will be a great new book, basically on sort of on Henry Wallace and what Henry Wallace meant in terms of American politics then, and one could easily imagine what might have happened in ensuing years. I think it is an interesting question, but as a historian, there are these kinds of questions that I ask myself. For example, let's not forget that when Truman became president, he actually did, in one of his very first speeches, push the idea of a second Bill of Rights and national health care. This was on his agenda. He also did push and actually created a Civil Rights Commission. So with that in mind, Henry Wallace believed pretty firmly in the New Deal agenda and in the Second Bill of Rights. The question was, could he have had the kind of influence on Congress that would have been necessary to make all of these things happen? And if he had that kind of influence, then Roosevelt might not have been pushed to drop him from the ticket in 44. So it's a little hard to grab hold of that. But then let me give you this other alternative history since it's on the agenda now. Wendell Willkie became the Republican candidate for president in 1940.
Right.
And Willkie himself was something of a liberal Republican, nowhere near the kind of liberal or social democratic figure that Roosevelt himself was. I mean, he came out of utility companies and things like that. But in the course of the war, Willkie and Roosevelt got pretty close, considering they had been opponents in 1940. And in 1942, he set out on a round-the-world trip, Willkie, in an American Air Force plane at Roosevelt's behest, basically as a goodwill mission around the world. And when he came back, he wrote a book, I believe it was titled One World. And in this book, he lays out a pretty clear social democratic kind of politics, and even calls even more aggressively than Roosevelt ever had at that point for really a civil rights campaign in America. That having come back from these other places in the world of people of color, he knew that that the United States would have a hard time convincing the world that it would be a leading nation of the free world unless it did something about Jim Crow and segregation in the South and cultural segregation in the North. But here's the thing. In 1944, I guess it was, Willkie and Roosevelt met at least once to talk about the possibility of creating a new political party, which Roosevelt portrayed as a capital L liberal party. And the story, as I've read it, is that Willkie said to him, "What about the South? What about the white supremacist South?" And Roosevelt's answer was, "Well, they can go off and create a party of their own, and maybe they'll even want to join with your very conservative Republican, brethren." So Roosevelt had this idea that they would create this liberal party and, in essence, really create a political force for the post-war period. Willkie couldn't bring himself to agree to it in 1944. And the idea, he said, was, let's wait and see what happens after 44. But Willkie dies after the 44 elections. He died rather young, and sadly he died, because he would have been a great force in the Republican Party, even if they hadn't created a new party. And of course, Roosevelt dies the next spring. So think about the alternative history of Wendell Willkie and Roosevelt had created an American liberal party to bring in the progressive Republicans from the Midwest and the West, and liberals from the Northeast, and it would have been a remarkable turn of events, I think.
Or if FDR hadn't lived, we could have seen Willkie Wallace 48 as a unity ticket on the American liberal, the kind of bipartisanship I could get behind.
I can imagine. And by the way, nothing I meant. I don't think Roosevelt should have dropped Wallace in 44. Let me make that clear.
Okay, well, you are on the record for those Wallace acolytes out there. And by the way, and we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately, but my mother made it very clear to me that she did vote for Henry Wallace as a third-party candidate in 1948 and was proud of it. So,
Wow.
So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. There's so much more we could talk about, but it's been a fascinating conversation for me. Harvey J. Kaye, historian, sociologist, author of the book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms. As always,
one
real quick.
I hope we can talk in the fall. I've got a new book coming out this fall. It's a collection of my speeches and essays of the past 10 years, and it's titled "Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again." And I would love an opportunity to talk to you about it when it comes out. I can send you a copy when it does.
That's a deal. We'll pencil that in now.
Great.
So, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you.